4,000 years ago, ancient Britons were building Stonehenge. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Nebtawire Menutep IV died, ending the 11th dynasty and starting the 12th. And in China, in the modern-day province of Qinghai, someone is making something novel. Noodles. Possibly even the world's first. They would not end up eating these noodles, either because they met their demise in a horrible natural disaster, or because they dropped the bowl. We don't know exactly what happened. They found a bowl like this, so you be the judge. Whatever happened, it allowed archaeologists, almost 4,000 years later, to excavate and analyze the contents, and for us to recreate them, thus forming the first step in our journey in which we recreate historical noodle dishes to retrace the steps from the first Chinese noodles to a modern bowl of ramen. The road to ramen. In 2002, digging was ongoing at the Latzia excavation site. At one point, archaeologists uncovered a room with loads of pots and pans. Initially, these did not prove very interesting. Until they unearthed one vessel which appeared to contain noodles. To this date, these were the earliest noodles ever found. This was an especially exciting find because the civilization, which resided at this site, did not leave behind any written records. So archaeological finds like this are all we have to go on. The fact that they even had noodles shows quite an advanced degree of technological development. And this was in a normal homestead, not the court of a king. So this is why we think these noodles are a great starting point for our road to ramen. To make this first noodle, we are going to need the grain it was made with. Millet. No, not quite yet. The scientists who recreated these noodles wrote down their findings in an article, which we will use as a guide. This article tells us that we should start with whole millet. I'm excited, aren't you? Oh, come on, cheer up. When has this ever gone wrong? Anyway, this here is foxtail millet, which, to be fair, is very hard to find these days in a non-hulled form. The only way we were able to find this was through specialist bird food sellers. You can buy these for human consumption as well, but they will be hulled, and according to the scientists who recreated this process, we want the non-hulled ones. After plucking them, we are going to need the mortar and pestle for this one. Give them a good grinding, but don't turn them into dust. We're looking to release the husks. We want a gentle pounding, a smooth grind. Once most of the husks are loose, we're going to have to remove about 70% of the husks. No, there are easier methods for this. This is one of the oldest tricks in the book. Winnowing, which is the practice of using wind to separate the chaff from the millet. Find yourself a nice windy area. You can do this with a fan indoors, but it will be a pain to clean up. Trust us, we tried. So go somewhere where your biodegradable refuse will make local wildlife happy. Pour the contents from one bowl into another. If all goes well and there's enough wind, the chaff will be swept away by the wind while your heavier millet just falls down. If there's not enough wind, you'll need someone to help you make some wind. If you don't have any friends, throw them up and blow. Might want to close your eyes or wear goggles. Do be careful not to blow too hard, you might end up losing all your millet. Yes, we were surprised too, how a technique that has been in use for literally over 10,000 of years still works. Now, you might think we are going to ground this into flour, but we're not going to do this. Instead, we're just going to soak these overnight in some water. We'll pick this up in the morning. The next day, the water should have gotten a bit gloopy. Drain the millet and give them a good mashing so they begin to form a dough-like substance. We did this in small batches because it's easier to handle. After everything's been mashed up, let it rest for 1 hour. Then start pounding it again for about 2 to 3 hours. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't really know what to say. It's what it says here on the instructions. Now, just between us, the scientists who did this tried to achieve a noodle that was over 2 meters long. So you can probably get away with doing this for 20 minutes or so. Still a painful amount, but more reasonable. We made the human do it for the real 2 hours though. I think that's enough pounding. We are now going to steam our well-pounded ball for about 10 minutes. These noodles were not cut or pulled, but pressed in a hurler press, which usually looks like this. Ours isn't as rustic though. The dough needs to be warm and a little bit wet to be pressed easily, hence why we are steaming it. After 8 or so minutes, take it off the steamer and pound it a bit more. No need to go for hours on end this time, just 1 or 2 minutes to spread the warmth around through the dough. Put it back in the steamer for a quick minute or two to warm up and extrude them directly into the boiling water. At least that's how it's supposed to go. We hit a bit of an obstacle. All of our noodles disintegrated the moment they hit the boiling water, and we never got to the smooth texture shown in the Lazia article. We tried the normal millet for human consumption, which just completely dried out in steaming, and many other methods and techniques. Going back to the original article, we noticed that there are different types of foxtail millet, something we were unaware of. The article mentions glutinous and non-glutinous foxtail millet, but we have no idea how to tell one from the other. All we know is that the length shown in the article was never obtained by us, regardless of which technique we tried. Our best result came with this bird feed millet, which was grown in China, but even this was not close to the intended result. So we have to admit defeat on this one. When not boiling the noodles, we can press some nice looking ones, which would at least give you an indication of how they should have looked. Not ideal for dinner, but it's a fun little experiment. A lovely living museum piece. Don't worry, we are still making noodles. We will need to fast forward a bit to the Han Dynasty, which reigned from circa 202 BC to 220 AD. At this point, wheat and more advanced milling technology had made its way from the west to China via the Silk Route. Around 200 AD, a dictionary named the Xieming mentions Bing. This was described as food made of flour and water. Now, that's a bit vague, and the writer of the Xieming apparently agrees, because they go on to list a bunch of examples, including Hubing, Zhengbing, Tangbing, Jiebing, Suebing, Microsoft Bing, Jinbing, Swarbing, and Matthew Perry. All of these are different applications of dough, ranging from deep frying to mixing with marrow. The one we're interested in is the Tangbing, which freely translates as broth dough. And we can all see how this is our next step in our road to ramen. We're not quite there yet. There were ample varieties of dough in broth, and most of them are still eaten to this day. Some are fried flat discs from which bits are torn, while others are mildly leavened breads, which act as a sort of crouton. We are going for a method contained in the Jimin Yao Shu from around 533 AD and make Yin, whatever that meant, as this is the Tangbing variant closest to ramen we could find. First, we're going to make a ball of dough. There are obviously no sources giving us exact measurements, so we are going to base this on previous pasta and noodle making experience. 300 grams of plain flour, 120 milliliters of water, and a pinch of salt. Mix all of these gently, stirring as you add the room temperature water bit by bit. Once everything is incorporated, knead until smooth. We're going to roll this in a sausage, and it will become clear why later. While this rests, we're going to make our broth. Archaeologists have actually found soup, which is still liquid. More specifically in Xi'an, home of the Terracotta Army. Here they found a sealed bronze vessel which contained a soup made from the bones of a young dog. Oh dear. I know this is hard, but we need to do this. For the sake of historical integrity. Actually, there might be a better way. We don't have any archaeological finds for this, but it was during the Han Dynasty that Buddhism was introduced to China and vegetarian diets did gain popularity, so we have developed our own recipe based on ingredients available at the time. Quick aside, for the next episode we will be making a recipe based on a source from the Song Dynasty, so make sure you subscribe for that one. Back to the Han Dynasty. Take a large pot and coat the bottom with a bit of oil. Add in slices of garlic and fermented bean curd. Give them a gentle frying. Once they are fragrant, cover this with about 4 liters of water. Then add in some shiitake, wood ear mushroom and ginger. Feel free to add any aromatics you like. We opted for fennel, spring onion and our secret ingredient, roasted Chinese leaf, also known as Napa cabbage. Bring all of this to a boil and then reduce it to a simmer. At this stage, add some Szechuan peppercorns, which were believed to bring good fortune. Hasn't worked for us yet though. Let this go for about 2 hours, after which we will strain and chill the broth. This is a vegetable broth, so it can stay good for quite some time. As per the sauce, we shall rip the dough into strands roughly the thickness of a chopstick. The sauce does not specify how thick the chopsticks should be, so you can make it easy on yourself and get a chunky chopstick. Every strand should be about 30 centimeters long. Then soak these in cold water. At the same time, heat up a separate pot of water to boil the noodles in later. Yes, this is rather odd, but it's what it says in the text. Once your water is boiling, take your noodles out of the cold water. Not yet. Flatten them first. We're looking for the thickness of a leek leaf. You can flatten them between your fingers or on a work surface. The text does not specify a method. We found our work surface to be easier. Then throw them into boiling water as they are shaped. It will take around a minute for these to be ready, so use this time to get out a bowl. Fish your noodles out of the boiling water and place them in your bowl. Then ladle over some of your warm broth. You can add tofu for protein and spring onions for garnish, like we did here. This is entirely optional. Now it's time to tuck into ramen's great granddaddy. It's a weird sensation. The noodles are chunky, but because they've been soaked, they're very smooth. They pair nicely with the broth. On top of that, they are budget friendly and vegetarian. We hope you enjoyed this first step on the road to ramen. Hello and welcome into Burner, where today we continue our Road to Ramen series. In this video, part 1, we will be making the broth for the medieval noodles, which are the subject of part 2. To make this, we'll be following a recipe from the Song Dynasty, using lamb, spring onion, pepper, and a secret ingredient. It was written down in the cookbook Shanjia Qinggong. Thank you. A cookbook by Song Dynasty statesman and poet Lin Hong. Even though he was a poet, this recipe is not a poem. In the upcoming episode, we will see why this is a good thing. The recipe contained in his book, the Shanjia Qinggong. Thank you. The recipe itself is very simple. Take mutton or lamb neck, put it in a clay pot. We don't have a clay pot, so we're using cast iron. Flood it with water, adding green onions and Szechuan peppercorns. So far, nothing special. But this is where it gets interesting. The Shanjia Qinggong itself calls it the secret ingredient. This secret ingredient is apricot kernel. You might not find this in your local supermarket, but Asian shops and health food shops tend to stock this. If you're buying this from a Chinese shop, you might have to look for dried almond rather than apricot kernel. It's a long story. It comes in both whole and ground form. If you have the whole ones, lightly crush them up and put them in your soup. Now, bring all of this to a boil and leave it there until the meat falls over the bones. Should be a couple of hours. One other thing where this recipe differs from a lot of broth recipes is that it instructs us to do all of this over a live flame. In other words, slightly higher heat than usual. This will result in a cloudier broth, differing from the clear soups which you see in most Chinese broths these days. There is a further part to this recipe, but it is a short poetic flourish about how it is a shame that this was not available during the Han Dynasty. It is, however, at the end and does not impede our understanding of the recipe, which is something that will never happen later. If you want to see how we use this broth, make sure to subscribe. Once our broth is ready and the meat is falling off the bones, we're going to sieve it. Now that we have our broth, we're going to place it on a cooling rack so it cools down quickly, as we don't want bacteria getting too comfy in there. Broth that isn't eaten straight away should be fridged or frozen. We are fridging half of it in these airtight jars and freezing the other half in a bag. The frozen stock will last a few months. The stock merely chilled should be consumed within a week though. Also make sure to bring it to a boil again before consumption. So, what do we eat this stock with? Well, for that you'll have to check out our next video. In the early years of the second millennium, Leif Erikson settled in North America, decided it was a bit underwhelming, and came back. We hope he at least brought some souvenirs. Meanwhile, a Frenchman conquered England, leaving a lasting mark on the history of Britain and wider Europe. And in China, a man is watching noodles dry. These noodles and their toppings are the next step in our journey, where we trace the steps from the earliest Chinese noodles to a modern bowl of ramen. The road to ramen. Last episode we saw the origins of Chinese noodles which used millet. Then we jumped a few thousand years to the Han Dynasty and saw the first use of wheat in noodles. Today we make another jump of almost 1000 years, straight to the Song Dynasty, and more specifically to the city of Kaifeng, or as it was known back then, Dongjing. It was around this time that we start seeing mention of the tradition to eat long noodles for one's birthday. There was even a story where an impoverished nobleman traded his sleeves for flour to make birthday noodles for the emperor, this being the only instance of a sleeve-based currency that we know of. Poems from this period tell us about how the length of noodles is symbolic of longevity. Short noodles might be a side effect of not getting the emperor noodles for his birthday. Why are we focusing on Dongjing? It's here that we see the emergence of a culture of noodle shops. Under the Northern Song, curfews were relaxed and we started seeing the emergence of genuine nightlife, with noodle shops staying open throughout the night. We know this from a very good source written by a refugee living under the Southern Song, writing about his old home after it had fallen to the Mongols. They reminisce in great detail, telling us about the shouting of waiters to the kitchen and how one had to order at noodle stalls. When looking at the history of ramen, this paints an awfully familiar picture. This work is called Dreams of Splendor of the Eastern Capital. The name, Eastern Capital, is still in use today by a different city, Tokyo. Coincidence? We'll let you decide. So, what was in these bowls? There was broth, which we made in a different video, toppings, to which we will get in the second part of this video, and the actual dough strands, which is where we'll start. In this era, many different types of noodles were being eaten in China. They were still often called tangbing, however, a new catch-all term for all things noodle was on the rise: mian. The word that today still means noodle in Mandarin. The noodle that became mainstream in this period is the one that today is called guamian, translated noodles that are hung, to dry. This makes perfect sense in a historical context. With the rise of noodle shops and the general commercialization, it makes sense that a method that allowed noodles to be made in bulk and preserved for a couple of days became more popular. In addition, we found poetry from the Song period which describes the scene of a celebration banquet, where guests were served bowls of noodles resembling fine strands of silver. So from that we are concluding that they were fine and contained only wheat, water and salt, no eggs or alkali, as this would turn them yellow, and any good poet would describe that as gold. We will get to the golden noodles later in this series though. Make sure you subscribe for that so you don't miss it. For these noodles, we know that the noodles were long, they were fine, they were white, and they were hung to dry. For the method on how to make the noodles, we did not find a source from the Song dynasty, but got one from a little bit later in the Yuan dynasty, from a statesman and painter called Ni Zan, who wrote a book called Cloud Forest Hall Collection of Rules for Drinking and Eating. He doesn't provide amounts, so we added these ourselves. Add a pinch of salt to 150 milliliters of water. Then add the water to 300 grams of plain white flour, giving us a hydration of around 50%. Feel free to add tiny amounts of water by way of damp hands if you still have dry patches. Mix all of it and then knead 20 times. Yes, 20 times. That's what the rules of Cloud Forest Hall say. Don't look at me. After kneading, wrap it in cloth. We are using a clean tea towel. Then let it rest for about 15 minutes. Repeat this process 4 times. After doing the 4 sets of kneading, we are rolling it out with a rolling pin. We have to get it fine. That's the most important bit. We've cut ours in smaller sheets to make it more workable. To keep these sheets from sticking, we are using rice flour. Now it is time for cutting. The recipe only says that they should be cut. It does not provide a shape or technique, so we are going to use our own experience from making pasta here and cut them into tagliatelle-like ribbons, which we think is very fitting as this is also the period in which Marco Polo visited these lands. Once cut, we're going to hang them up on our rack, which isn't as impressive as the drying solution usually used for these types of noodles, but it will work for us. Once dried, gently remove and store in a dry container. Some will snap, that's fine. If all of this is too much effort for you, there is another way. You can just buy these. In all fairness, this is just salt water and flour. There is probably no real discernible difference between store-bought dried noodles and these. Admittedly, the noodles from 1000 years ago probably weren't as smooth or white. If you do make them yourself, remember that your drying solution probably isn't as efficient as the industrial one, and yours will only last about 5 days. Oh, don't act like that. I would have still had you make them from scratch, whether we had led with this or not. Now that we have our noodles, it is time for the next element, the toppings. Now, there was a great variety of food available in Song Dynasty China. However, this is still road to ramen, so we're going to narrow this down to something that could have been a precursor to modern ramen toppings. Here we have a normal, fairly standard bowl of ramen. No, that's over here. Now, there are loads of toppings which you might regard as staples, like the egg, no, over here, and the nori sheet. But in Japan, a lot of these are actually paid extras. One thing, however, that is intrinsically linked with ramen is the chasu, the pork. So for our medieval Chinese noodles, we are going to need medieval Chinese pork. And when it comes to pork, China, under the Song, got poetic. Song dynasty poet and statesman Su Dongpo, also known as Su Shi, wrote an ode to pork during his time in Guangzhou, away from the imperial capital. This poem was so influential that a lot of Chinese restaurants will still name a pork dish after him. The poem goes as follows. Is the lady ready? Yes.
净洗当
Clean your pot.
少焯水
Use a little bit of water.
柴头掩烟焰不起
Use small amounts of grass and wood to maintain gentle smoldering embers.
待它自熟莫催它
Don't rush. Let it stew by itself.
火候足时它自美
It will become beautiful on its own once it is done.
黄州好猪肉
Guangzhou has great pork.
价贱如泥土
It is cheap as mud.
贵者不肯吃
The rich will not eat it.
贫者不解煮
The poor do not understand how to make it.
早晨起来打2碗
I have 2 bowls of it when I wake up in the morning.
饱得自家君莫管
I am satiated. Leave me be. Okay, maybe this wasn't the best approach. It's a lot of steps to just make slowly boiled pork. You could have included some seasonings. There is another method. Ming Dynasty scholar Han Yi wrote a cookbook called Yi Ya's Lost Wishes, or Yi Ya's Lost Methods. Yi Ya being a legendary, almost mythical Chinese cook who lived way before the Song Dynasty. So we're not cheating really. Although this is a cookbook and not a poem, it is still written in a very poetic way. It starts with a description of the meat. Take a tender piece of pork, half lean, half fat. We're going to take that this means pork belly. Cut into die-sized pieces. Problem? I see. Go for the D6 there. A D12 would be barbaric. Cook with half water and wine. The recipe tells us not to use too much, so we're going to make sure the bits are just covered. It also does not specify whether we're starting from cold or warm, so we are starting from cold. Now leave that on the hob. Once it comes to a boil, take it over the heat after 1 minute of boiling. Take out the pork and set aside. Keep the blanching liquid. With this set aside, we're going to take a spoonful of lard and beat this soft in a mortar. This is no cholesterol-friendly cooking. Mash the lard and mix it with the sauce. Well, the recipe just says the sauce and doesn't specify anything else, so we are going to gratefully fill those gaps with nice things. We are going to use a mixture of dark and light soy sauces and fish sauce. Then add in what the recipe calls the sands of fragrant peppercorns. We are going to take that this means freshly ground red and green Szechuan peppercorns. Now mix this with the beaten lard. Once everything is prepared, put it in a pot and bring it up to temperature so the lard melts. Then add the meat back to the pot. Now add the blanching liquid. Han Yi, or is it Yi Ya, tells us not to use too much wine and water, presumably so it can reduce. At this point we're supposed to season to taste. The recipe reminds us not to use the green part of the spring onion. This is fair enough, so we're adding some spring onion whites and some extra soy sauce to taste. Once reduced, we are going to thicken our sauce, as per the recipe's instructions with mung bean powder. Once thickened, get the meat out of the pot. And this will be the final element of our noodle soup. Prepare your bowl, starting with some freshly boiled dried noodles. Ladle over the broth, which we made in our other video. Remember to boil and season with salt before use. Then we are adding our freshly stewed Yi Ya pork with some of its liquid. Finally, we are topping it off with some blanched pak choy for color and nutrition. Add some extra soy sauce if you want. Now imagine you're in a late-night noodle shop in Kaifeng during the splendor of the golden years of the Song Dynasty and enjoy your medieval precursor to ramen. Our human found these surprisingly good, and we really do recommend you try these for yourself. Thank you. Hi all and welcome into Burner, where today we are making a traditional Chinese beef stock, which historically speaking is a bit odd, as throughout a lot of China's history, beef was forbidden. The central government did not want peasants killing working animals like oxen or horses, although this law wasn't always enforced. It does show there was a strong social stigma against the wastefulness of eating beef. In 1882, the American missionary John Livingston Nevius wrote, "Beef is never exposed for sale in the Chinese markets." There is a strong universal prejudice against eating beef. There was one community in which this stigma did not exist though, the Chinese Muslims. As we know, Chinese cuisine is quite keen on pork, but we also know that practicing Muslims and Jews are banned from eating the flesh of the swine. So, Chinese Muslims in southern China compensated this with more poultry and mutton, whereas in the north, where most Chinese Muslims lived and live to this day, beef was more popular. Very popular actually, so popular as to the point where the area around Beijing's oldest mosque became known as Cow Street. You have to really like something a lot to get your street named after it. Oh. The bulk of Chinese Muslim population, today and in the 18th century, could be found here. So it's not as if they could go fishing. The recipe we are going to make in part 2 of this episode is what most people agree is the starting point for Lanzhou Ramen in 1799. However, there's a problem. This recipe comes from a tradition where it would be passed down orally from generation to generation. For a very long time, we therefore assumed that this recipe would be lost to time. That wouldn't be extraordinary though. It's quite common for recipes and techniques from this period of Chinese history to simply be declared gone once a cook or shopkeeper has passed away. Not much has changed there if we're honest. So we had already cobbled together our own recipe, using period appropriate ingredients like cumin, cassia and ginger. But then we found this. Yeah, we couldn't read it either. But we got somebody who can read Chinese better than Google Translate to summarize it for us. According to this website, a descendant of Chen Weijing, who is widely agreed to be the progenitor of modern Lanzhou Ramen, spilled the proverbial beans in a speech. The recipe was apparently passed down as a poem, because of course it was. So, what went into this secretive broth? First up, beef shin. Between 1.5 and 2 kilos. This is a pretty cheap cut, but also very hard. Pretty much only usable to grind into mince or boil to destruction, which is exactly what we are going to do. Next up, we need beef bones. Unlike with French fond, we're not looking for this to congeal, so just a few will do. We got marrow bones here, but they don't need to be necessarily. Now for the aromatics. Lanzhou beef stock recipes found in cookbooks these days usually have 6 to 10 aromatics. This one has over 20, so we are going to need a nice big container for these. We're going to mention all the ingredients mentioned in the poem, but we won't be adding all of them in, as some of them are going to be difficult to come by. First up is the fruit of the cassia tree, also called the cassia fistula. You can still get that these days, but it's pretty hard and expensive to get, so we are simply going to use some cassia bark. It is sold in most supermarkets under the name sweet cinnamon. Cardamom, easy enough to get. Next up is acurantis root. We searched long and hard for it, but we were not able to find this. Next up is the root of a plant called Aucklandia lapidecni, which we were able to find in a traditional Chinese apothecary. The next aromatic is known as female ginseng. You should be able to find this in most Chinese supermarkets. Now we're adding some cloves, bay leaves. A bit trickier than cloves and bay leaves, but not really hard, is long pepper. You can find this in Indian specialty shops or online quite easily. Next up is the Langshajia Tsaoko, also known as black cardamom. Again, most Chinese supermarkets will stock this. Then there's an ingredient which the poem calls fragrant. We have no idea what they meant or what this is supposed to be. If you know, let us know in the comments please. Sand ginger. Then we are adding in shell ginger, which we got from the Chinese apothecary. Next up is the Plantago asiatica. The traditional pharmacist thought it was very funny that we bought this, as it has no discernible scent or flavor. We're also adding a tea called Red Robe. Again, most Chinese specialty shops will have this. We got ours from the apothecary. Then add 1 star anise, coriander seeds, easy enough, a big piece of fresh galangal. Then there's Rehmannia glutinosa, another ingredient with a strong background in Chinese traditional medicine, so we're adding a bit of that. Next up is something the poem calls Moon Mountain ginger. We decided that was just ginger. Then some fennel seeds, 1 whole nutmeg, and the dried peel of a tangerine. Again, easy enough to obtain in Chinese supermarkets. And then lastly, there's the Hopea haianensis. We are not adding this one because, well, exactly. You might have gleaned that a lot of these ingredients come to us from traditional Chinese medicine. The medicinal flavor associated with this is, regardless of any alleged health benefits, quite popular in large parts of Asia. There are entire restaurant chains throughout the Chinese-speaking world that predominantly serve medicinal food. So even though it probably won't cure your eczema, you might just like the aroma. We, though, are not too keen and are just adding all these ingredients to be true to the original recipe. If you're not interested in being authentic, we would just add these. Put the meat and bones in a stock pot and bring them to a boil, quickly blanching them for about 1 minute. Then clean them off and refresh your water. Then refill the pot, add in the sack of aromatics, and bring everything up to a boil and then immediately reduce to a simmer. Ladle off any impurities that float to the top. Since you've already blanched these bones, most of them should be gone. Keep the heat at a very gentle level, bubbles barely breaking the surface. As we said before, unlike its French counterpart, Chinese stock should remain clear. it should look like clear tea. So in order to achieve this, we need to cook it gently so it doesn't get cloudy. Put a lid on it and leave it for 2 hours. The story of this cut of meat will be continued in part 2. Leave the rest to gently simmer further for another hour. At this point, your stock should look like this, nice and clear. After letting it simmer for another hour, we are going to sieve our stock. Remove your aromatics bag and decant your stock into sealable or freezable containers. Let it now cool down on a rack. Speed is of the essence. Once cooled down, fridge or freeze them. Our stock is supposed to be clear, and at the 2-hour mark, it was. So you might want to stop after 2 hours. We followed methods that were clearly not designed for 200-year-old poems. There is luckily an easy solution if your broth is too dark. A quick 3-to-1 dilution with fresh water will get the broth back to its clear state, as it should be, per the rules of Lanzhou Ramyeon, which we will make in part 2. In the final years of the 18th century, a young boy receives the world's first vaccine. A Frenchman found the Rosetta Stone, and in northwestern China, a man is getting a workout. It's the product of this workout that will be the topic of today's video, in which we continue our journey from the oldest Chinese noodle to a modern bowl of ramen. The road to ramen. After having looked at medieval noodles last time, this week we turn to noodles from the late 18th century. Did they originate there and then? Well, that's a good question. But first, let's explain to the uninitiated what Lanzhou Ramyeon actually are. Lanzhou Ramyeon are famous noodles from, well, Lanzhou in northwest China. It's an extremely popular noodle dish in and outside the Chinese-speaking world. But you probably knew about them because of the way they are made. These noodles aren't cut, they're pulled. Nice try. The pulling of Lanzhou noodles is a bit more involved. It might seem daunting and impossible now, but we'll get through it. Yes, you too can make pulled noodles. It's an understatement to say that the origins of Lanzhou Ramyeon are obscure and the subject of much debate. Some traditions place the origin with the Hui people over 1,500 years ago. Others say that the famous noodles have only been around since 1915. We think the truth is somewhere in the middle, a bit more nuanced. Some form of pulled noodle in beef broth has probably been around for centuries. However, we doubt it would have been very recognizable. The theoretical origin that we like and are going to use as a premise for this video is 1799. This was, according to the story, the year in which Chen Wei-jing taught Ma Liu-tzu the recipe, which had been handed down through his family for generations. Chen Wei-jing had landed a well-paying job as a civil servant, so he handed the family recipe to his poorer friend Ma Liu-tzu to help him set up a business. Ma Liu-tzu, now armed with a top recipe for beef noodles, left his native Huangqing. Get the lady.
Huaiqingfu.
Ma Liu-tzu brought the noodles from there to Lanzhou, where they've become a staple of the city ever since. It were the successors of Ma Liu-tzu and Chen Wei-jing who went on to establish the 5 rules of Lanzhou Ramyeon. The ramyeon from this tradition must contain a number of colors. We're going to do these countdown style. The 5th element is the clear stock, which we've done in this video. Then there's C1, referring to the yellow color of the noodles. Don't worry, we'll get to those. Sambai, the white of the daikon radish. Erlu, the green of the coriander. And finally Yihong, the red of the chili oil. Yes, chilies. The story of Lanzhou Ramyeon is also the story of chilies in Chinese cuisine. Chilies came to China in the 15th century via Portuguese traders who got them from the New World. The chilies proved popular, but initially not for their taste, but for their color. Therefore, in the richer coastal areas, chilies were used as a novelty, to give food a red color, an auspicious symbol in Chinese culture, for which they only needed small amounts. However, in the poorer regions, like Lanzhou, they were a massive hit. Salt was prohibitively expensive in northwestern China, so the chilies, which can grow pretty much everywhere, and, thanks to their capsaicin, keep for a very long time when dried, were eagerly adopted as a flavoring to compensate for the lack of salt. In the 19th and 20th century, and especially during the Cultural Revolution, chilies went on to become a staple of Chinese cuisine. But we now know they started as a salt replacement for the poor. So for our lanzhou ramen, we are going to make chili oil. First, take a handful of dried chilies and chop them up roughly. Then add them to a mortar along with some lightly toasted sesame seeds. Give this all a good grind. We want them to be nicely crushed, but there is no need to pulverize them. Place your crushed sesame and chili in a bowl, ideally one that you are not too attached to. If you've got a chipped one, this is where they shine. Now put that bowl in a shatterproof bigger bowl. It will become clear later why we are doing this. Take half a liter of rapeseed oil and add in some spring onion, a bay leaf, and a star anise. All these aromatics are optional, and if you want the authentic pauper oil, you would leave them out. They make it a lot better though. We're going to get this oil ripping hot, just below smoke point. If you want to be sure, you can use a thermometer. Between 160 and 180 degrees Celsius, you're good to go. Carefully fish out the aromatics, or if you have a lid like ours, just pour your oil straight over the crushed chili and sesame seeds. See why we needed that shatterproof bowl? Now, let this cool all the way down to room temperature and then store it in a sealable container. We keep ours in the fridge and it easily lasts a month. Now that's ready, we have to get to it. Come on now, just follow the instructions and all will be well. We need to make the ramyeon, the noodles. Ramyeon literally translates to stretched noodle. Now, there are ample types of stretched noodles in Chinese cuisine, from very simple ones like biang biang noodles to extremely advanced types like the dragon beard, where the act of pulling them is an attraction on its own. We are going to make the classic ramyeon noodles because of two reasons. Firstly, there's the theory that ramen get their name from ramyeon. We will deal with this when we actually get to ramen. Secondly, these noodles, like ramen, contain an additive. We'll get to that later in this video, but we're going to start with the very basic beginnings, the dough. We are using a method from a YouTube channel called Peter Pulls Noodles. If you want to have a serious stab at doing this, we strongly recommend that channel. Link in the description. We are first making a single person portion. So we're taking 250 grams of plain flour. Our protein level is 10.5%, which we think works perfectly. To this we add about 2 grams of salt. Lastly, we're adding about 165 grams or milliliters of tap water. Mix all of this and then cover with a damp cloth and wait for 3 hours. You can also wrap this in cling film, but they did not have that in 1799. What about these additives? Well, we first want to show you that you can do it without any additives. This is probably how the first noodles of this sort were made, through the technique of over-kneading. You can get the dough into a super stretchy state by simply stretching and folding. This will get all the gluten in the same direction, allowing us to stretch the dough. Admittedly, this did take us over an hour of working the dough. Apparently, you can skip this by using a stand mixer for half an hour, but it's $17.99 and there are no stand mixers either. Also, you need to pull and boil these noodles as soon as they are ready. If you let this dough rest, it will go stiff again. Don't worry about that pulling technique, we'll get to that, as we're not using these. This was mainly to show how unwieldy this is without any additives. And even if we were to use these, it would be wrong. They're just too white. As we know from the 5 rules, the noodles need to be yellow, which we are going to achieve by adding something blue, peng wei. Originally, this was the ash of a mugwort plant that grows on the plains of northwestern China. These days, the actual ash isn't used anymore since this is a very popular noodle and the plant is rather rare. So this synthetic replacement was developed, but it should yield the exact same result. For full authenticity, we would have to go to China, burn a bush and smuggle out the ash. But that's a bit out of budget, so we're going to use this type. Once you open the bag, store it in an airtight container, as this stuff reacts with the smallest amounts of moisture in the air, and it also stinks. We're making a fresh dough. We already add a tiny pinch of the peng wei to the flour. Apart from that, we are making the dough with the exact same proportions as we did the last one. When kneading it, you will notice it's already a lot more supple and a lot more yellow. Once it comes together, we're going to prepare some peng wei water, which is 1 part peng wei and about 4 to 5 parts water. You'll notice it gets this typical grey-blue hue. Add a little bit onto our dough and knead it in. It doesn't really show up on camera, but this dough is very yellow. You can actually see it change color when we add on the peng wei water. We're doing a few more stretch and folds like we did with the first dough, but unlike that one, this shouldn't take an hour. This should be done in 10 minutes, if not faster. When stretching your dough, it is important to quickly switch between tension and relaxation. If you're struggling, just act like an Italian stereotype. Come on, try it. See? Easy. There is a problem though. A lot of recipes and videos will tell you that you cannot get peng wei outside of China. That isn't entirely true. We got ours for about 12 to 13 pounds, and it took 3 weeks to get here. But we appreciate this might be too big an obstacle for some people. But there is another solution. Anyone who has ever made ramen will immediately think they know the answer. All the types of alkali. You know, the baking soda, the kansui, the potash. We are telling you now, don't. No, stop it. Come on now, put those away. It's true that peng wei contains alkali, and it's this alkali that causes the yellow color of the dough. But it also contains a bunch of other things like all of this. Some of these are dough relaxers, and we will see in the next episode that just adding alkali actually achieves the opposite, making dough really stiff and practically unpullable. So if you can't import the peng wei and baking soda won't do the trick, what can you do? Use nutritional yeast. Yes, the cheese for vegans, available in most supermarkets these days, contains a dough relaxant, and in addition, will provide the noodles with the required yellow color. We're making the exact same dough as before, but this time we're mixing in 20 grams of crushed nutritional yeast into our flour. Then, once needed, sprinkle on some extra yeast and knead this in with some extra water until you can no longer see any orange specks. Repeat this until the dough feels very loose and stretchy. Practice makes perfect here. As with the previous methods, once the dough is ready, we have to pull noodles. And since this is our for real attempt, we need to have everything ready. Our coriander needs to be chopped, our daikon sliced, and the beef shin we recovered from the stock making in part 1 needs to be cut up and put back in our stock to warm up along with it. Now have your spider, sieve, stock and boiling water at the ready. You should also have flour and a dough cutter ready on your workbench. After about 10 minutes of stretching and folding, your dough should be stretchy enough. When you fold the dough in half and you can bounce it back to full length with 2 bounces, your dough is ready to go. If stretchy but still a little bit too sticky, feel free to very lightly oil your dough or hands. Now flour your surface, but be aware. If you mess up after flouring, you will need to add fresh water and stretch and fold the dough a few times again, as the ratios will be messed up a bit. Take your dough and roll it out like this. Now comes the tricky part. This is where people often fail because the process is very daunting, and many will have the urge to pull slow and careful. Fight this urge. To do this properly, you have to yank them quick, and then let them rest on the bench. Lanzhou Ramen are known for having an aggressive technique. Hard yank, rest. Hard sudden pull, rest. Hard pull, rest. Hard sudden pull, rest again. When they are back to the length of the original sausage you started with, it is time to fold them. Hook the loop of your noodles over the tip of your middle fingers. Now pull up the knot in your hand to avoid the weak spot. Put your finger in the middle of the loop, tension the noodles, and repeat the process. Do this 5 times in total. Well, until you think they're thin enough. When filming this, our human got a bit excited after 4 pulls, so we only did 4. They're a bit thicker, but they're fine. When done, cut off the messy knot ball thing, shake off the excess flour, and throw them straight into the boiling water. Give it a quick stir with the spider, and after about 30 seconds to a minute, they'll be ready. Take them out and tip them into a sieve, then shock them under cold running water. This keeps them from overcooking and allows you to grab them with your hands. Put them in your bowl and ladle over some of the stock we made in the previous video. Add the meat, slices of daikon, the green coriander, and finally some spoonfuls of our chili oil. And there you go, you just made one of the most popular types of traditional Chinese noodles. And a very difficult type at that. It is said to fully master this process takes 10 years of study and practice. So we think we did all right. We have to admit, this was by far the hardest dish we've ever made on this channel. And it took us hours of practice to get to this level. But practice does pay off, because right after turning off the cameras, our human pulled a perfect batch with some leftover dough. He has since made this for dinner a couple of times, without too much pain. For those of you who really want to do this, we recommend checking out Peter's videos and at least consider getting the Peng Whey imported. The nutritional yeast is healthier, easier to obtain, and smells a lot better, but the results are not as consistent as with the real thing. For those who persevere, the results are amazing though. We really like these noodles, and we have no issue understanding why these noodles have been popular for over 200 years. Hi everyone and welcome into Burner, where today we will be making the stock we're using in our upcoming Juksing noodles video. Unlike in our previous stock videos, we are not painstakingly recreating an old recipe passed down the generations. No, for next week's rising bamboo noodles, the best stock we can think of is a wonton soup broth. Firstly, a good wonton soup broth usually contains chicken. In most cases, a carcass is used. But for this, we are going to use a fresh chicken, because we're just decadent like that. Then there is pork. We are using some pork ribs. It doesn't matter that much, but try and get a cut with some bone in it. You can also use pork bones, but that will be more work as you need to clean them. You need a pork element, as the combination of pork and chicken is often regarded as an essential element in good wonton stock. Thirdly, we're going to need an umami element, which usually comes from seafood, because, well, the sea is right there. Convenient. We are going to use some prawn shells, which we kept and froze from the last time we had fresh prawns for dinner. We're going to up it a little bit by using dried flounder. This stuff is extremely fishy. Real stalls would use a whole dried flounder and turn it into a powder. We are just buying powder from a jar. We admit that this last ingredient isn't as easy to get, so you can use alternatives like MSG or mushroom powder. You can use any umami element here, to be honest, so please let us know in the comments which one you used. We are looking for one that stinks a bit less than the flounder powder. Another typical ingredient for Cantonese stocks is cured ham or jinhua. This is, however, extremely hard to get in Europe, and this is coming to you from the people that imported Peng Whey. We think this is caused by a lack of demand, which is logical given that Europe itself produces plenty of good cured hams. Ergo, we are using some nice slices of prosciutto. As for the other aromatics, we will be using some ginger, spring onion and garlic. You can add some salt and soy sauce too, but we prefer to add these at the point of serving to keep our stock more versatile. We're going to first quickly blanch our meat. These pork ribs are very clean, so we don't really need to soak them in advance. Bring the pork and chicken to a boil and leave them there for 1 minute. After getting rid of the blanching water and cleaning our pot, we're putting the pork and chicken back in, along with our aromatics. Cover all of this with water and bring it to a simmer. As we've said before in this series, this is a traditional Chinese stock, so we want this to boil gently with minimal evaporation. It should come out looking like clear tea. After 2 hours of gentle simmering, we're first going to get out the chicken. This is still very good meat. You shouldn't be throwing this away. Then strain the remainder. Let it quickly cool down and then freeze or jar them. Like our previous stocks, it will last about a week in the fridge in a jar or a couple of months in the freezer. And there it is, a lovely stock that can serve as the base for many different Cantonese broth-based dishes. But we will be using it in our next video for Juksing noodles, known in English as rising bamboo noodles. At the start of the 20th century, in Belfast, White Star Line decided not to christen the Titanic. In America, the Wright brothers made their first flight. And in China, a man was bouncing up and down. This last one being the next step in our journey from the oldest Chinese noodle to a modern bowl of ramen. The road to ramen. In the previous installment of this series, we saw how additives can make dough loose and stretchy. However, the additives do more than just relax the dough. They also make the noodles alkaline. But what is alkali? We're not going to get into the science of it all, but know that alkali is the magic ingredient in ramen and many types of Chinese noodles that prevents them from taking up too much liquid, hence keeps them from going soggy. That signature bite ramen has? That's alkali. Cooking with alkali products is quite common around the entire world. Western examples include potassium carbonate, commonly known as potash, and sodium carbonate, which you probably have in your kitchen labeled baking soda. In Chinese cuisine, alkali is traditionally added by way of lye water, called kan sui, which on a molecular level is the exact same thing. There is no consensus as to when people actually started using lye water in cooking. Despite its industrial reputation, it does occur naturally. But we do know when the noodles we're making today came about. There is a lot of debate around which Chinese noodles were the direct predecessors of Japanese ramen. Some say it's the Lanzhou ramen we made in the previous episode, but we tend to disagree. Firstly, the type of additive is very different, and secondly, the noodles came along with immigration to Japan. And this immigration came from predominantly coastal areas, rather than deep, landlocked Lanzhou. Our preferred theory is the one also followed by the Yokohama Ramen Museum, which states that ramen came to Japan by way of Guangdong, also known as Canton. So, to understand how these noodles came about and how they made their way to Japan, we quickly need to explain the historical context. In Chinese history, the period from the early 1800s all the way to 1976 can be described, like the kids say these days, as wild. It's a bit of a simplification, but in the millennium preceding the 19th century, China had enjoyed, notwithstanding some power struggles at the top, relative stability. We say relative because there were, of course, periods of turbulence, but it was overall pretty stable compared to Europe. In the 19th century, all this was about to change, partly thanks to Europe. Rebellions, invasions, two opium wars, huge growth in population, and the de facto end of imperial rule, all of this while being dragged, kicking and screaming into the Industrial Revolution, meant that by the turn of the next century, China was a very different place. This is often called the century of humiliation among Chinese historians. One effect of the shift to a more commerce-oriented economy with more international trade was a massive growth in port cities, especially here in the Pearl River Delta, where, due to the British now being in control of Hong Kong, there was an access port to the British Empire. There were now people working in these ports in numbers never seen before. And they needed food. Street food hawkers would start appearing in areas where lots of workers congregated and along the routes they took to work. They tended to carry their goods and tools the traditional way, hung off poles, a practice still in use to this day. Now this is where some real ingenuity took place. As we said at the start of the video, the point of alkali noodles is that they have a nice bite. Alkali, without any dough relaxants like we get in pang wei, and the low hydration typical for these noodles, makes the dough extremely hard. And we mean really hard. As you have probably noticed, our human is a hefty chap, and even his full weight couldn't get the dough nicely supple. But the hawkers quickly figured out that their carrying pole could pull double duty. The pole would be a lever and the dough could be pressed by being close to the fulcrum. Originally, these noodles were called bamboo pole noodles. However, the word pole in Cantonese sounds the same as the word to lower, which has inauspicious connotations. So the name changed to rising bamboo noodles, or jukseng noodles. And it's these noodles we're going to make right now. First, we're going to take about 550 grams of flour, in which we've mixed a big pinch of salt. Then take 5 duck eggs. Yes, duck eggs. However, feel free to use chicken eggs if you want to. We're adding a few drops of kansui to our eggs, which we are beating. Then add all of this to our flour. It's best to stir while adding. Now, once you have the shaggy dough, you will already notice it's getting rock hard. We, of course, are not going to use the bamboo pole. I really don't think that short bamboo you got there will... Oh dear. Let's make this very clear, we strongly recommend nobody does this at home, and you shouldn't either. Even if it survives your weight, just don't... Oh god, I can't talk you out of this, can I? He's even doing a little countdown. Now don't say I didn't warn you. Okay, let's do it the alternative way. Take a Ziploc bag and put your dough in there. Leave a little gap for airflow. Then put it on a clean surface, get on that clean surface, and just start stepping on it. A little rhythmic dance to flatten it all out. It might not be as spectacular, but it is a lot less painful. Once the dough is soft enough to roll into thick sheets, we can get out our machine. Yes, we are using a pasta machine for this. Again, not as authentic as the bamboo, but a lot gentler on the loins. Start by cutting your main dough into smaller portions. Our portions are roughly 150 grams each. Feed your sheets through the machine and laminate them. We do this by folding the sheet each time we feed it through the machine. For this, the machine is on its widest setting. Do this step 10 times, then start narrowing your machine width and do 2 passes for each setting. Keep doing this until you get to the desired thickness. On our machine, that was 5. If, while rolling out, your sheet gets a bit sticky, simply apply a bit of corn flour or potato starch. Once your sheet has the desired length and thickness, give it another light dusting with starch and then roll them through the cutter attachment. Once cut into noodles, give them another light dusting with starch or corn flour and roll them into nests. And this shows why these types of noodles are more widespread than hand-pulled noodles. You can prepare them in advance and store them. Even without a refrigerator, we think these would easily last a full day. These are, after all, street food noodles, traditionally sold in stalls far away from the kitchen. Taste is subjective, but it is hard to argue with this level of convenience compared to hand-pulled noodles. There is no need to have your stock and toppings ready to go at a moment's notice. Speaking of stock and toppings, that's the next step. For stock, we are going to use our chicken, pork and prawn stock. We've made this in a separate video, which you can see here. Jokseng noodles are served with all kinds of toppings, but because this is road to ramen, we need to make char siu. We don't have an old source for this recipe, but a lot of restaurants in present-day Hong Kong and Guangzhou make it like this, and they often claim they have been doing it like this for over a century. So we're going to nick their recipes. These days, char siu is made using various types of pork cut, but traditionally it's made with pork shoulder. Also, we used pork belly in a previous episode and we'll be using it in a later episode. And our human needs to watch his cholesterol. Remove the skin and cut the shoulder into strips. You want these big enough so they don't burn, but thin enough so the marinade and heat can fully permeate them. Now we make the marinade. For the marinade, we start with 80 grams of sugar. Yes, that signature sweetness doesn't come out of nowhere. Then add a generous helping of 5 spice, 2 tablespoons of hoisin sauce, 2 tablespoons of oyster sauce, 2 grated cloves of garlic, a big dash of soy sauce, and some rough cut spring onions. If you want, you can also spruce this up with some Shaoxing wine. Be careful with these liquid ingredients though. You don't want your marinade to get too runny. It needs to stay viscous and syrupy. Then there is one last ingredient that we need to give the pork its signature deep red color. And it's food coloring. This is genuinely used by most restaurants these days. However, there is a less industrial ingredient. And that's red fermented bean curd. Add 2 tablespoons of the curd and 2 more of the red liquid into the marinade. Now we can add in the meat. Now put your slices in the marinade bowl and give it all a good massage so it's well covered. Cover and let it sit for at least 8 hours. Try not to go over 48 hours. We are going with 24 hours. Normally this is made in a charcoal grill, very similar to a conventional barbecue, which we don't have. But there is an alternative which might just be better. Your oven. Yes, the very same. About an hour before you want to eat, get out your grill and coat the tray underneath with some tin foil. While doing this, start preheating your oven to 220 degrees Celsius. While our oven is preheating, we're going to prep some other things. Firstly, we're going to pop a tray in the oven in which we are going to place ice cubes while the meat is cooking. This is optional. It prevents the meat from drying out. Then we're going to prepare our glaze, which will consist of the marinade and a new ingredient, maltose sugar, which just goes to show how modern this actually is. This stuff is pretty hard and to be workable should be softened with a dash of boiling water, like we're doing here. Try to get it to the consistency of a good runny honey. If you can't buy this or this is just too much work, use honey. This can take quite some time, so keep at it. It will suddenly loosen up. By now your oven should be up to temperature. Take your meat out of the marinade and put it on the grill. Now place the grill in the hot oven, throw an ice cube or 2 into the tray we placed underneath the grill. Remove the spring onions from the marinade. It's very likely that the juices from the meat made the marinade runny. Don't worry, that's what the maltose sugar or honey is for. Add this in until the marinade has a viscous consistency again. After 15 minutes, take the pork out of the oven and give it its first layer of very shiny glaze. Repeat this again after 25 minutes in the oven and again after 35. Add fresh ice each time you add a new layer of glaze. Be warned, it will get a little bit smokier each time you open the oven. After 45 minutes, take out the meat and give it a final coating with just maltose sugar. Don't put it back in the oven, just let it rest at room temperature for at least 10 minutes. And we're finally ready to have some noodles. Take the chicken, pork and prawn shell stock and season it with salt, pepper and soy sauce before bringing it to a boil. Get out your noodles and take out one nest. Boil them for just under 1 minute. You don't need a fancy noodle strainer like we have here, but they're very cheap and very convenient. Get out your noodles, drain them well and place them in your bowl. Now ladle over the stock until the noodles are nicely flooded. Put in your sliced char siu and optionally garnish with some blanched pak choy. When this is all done, you can baptize your plate of noodles. And I hereby christen thee Juk Sing Noodles. Now get slurping. This is really good stuff, and we know that the human will be making this again, even though it is quite a bit of work. He won't try using the bamboo pole again though. These were the noodles that then got onto the boat and made their way across the Sea of Japan to become modern day ramen. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the culmination of this journey. Hi everyone and welcome into Burner, where today we will be making the stock which we're using to make Hakata style Tonkotsu ramen in our upcoming video. It will get very jiggly. The thick creamy broth you know as Tonkotsu was, according to the legend, invented by accident. In Kurume, a town in the Fukuoka prefecture on the island of Kyushu, a shop called Nanking Senryo had popularized a broth which was a mixture of all the stuff that was the rage in Tokyo, which we will get to next week, and a local dish called Nagasaki Shampon. A man by the name of Katsumi Sugino decided to make his own version of this for his stall called Sankyu. One day he was making the broth as per usual, but Sugino-san got distracted, forgot about his stock and left it on much too long. This might be a myth though, as versions differ. Some say it was his mother. When they realized this, the broth had reduced a lot. It had become very thick and very white. However, when tasting the broth, everybody loved the result. This thick creamy stock became the basis of what we call Tonkotsu ramen today. These days, unlike Nanking Senryo, Sankyu is no longer around. We wonder why. Whatever it was, we have to start with bones. Once we have these, we're going to soak them in clean water overnight. Make sure the bones are completely submerged. The next morning, pour off the dirty water and place the bones in a large pot. Cover with fresh water, bring to a boil over high heat and let it boil for 3 to 5 minutes. Then drain the bones and rinse them off with cool water. Leave the meat on, but try to get rid of blood patches and things like that using something like a skewer or a metal chopstick. After this, all the hard work is pretty much done. Now put all bones back in the pot which you've cleaned and cover them with plenty of water. Just before heating it up, make a mental note of where the water level is. We are using the level of our handles for this. Optionally, you can add in a small dash of apple cider vinegar. Now bring your water to a boil, then reduce the heat to medium, so it stays at a steady but rolling boil. Scoop off the small amounts of scum that will still float up. Now for the first 4 hours we're going to keep the stock topped up with boiling water. This is why we made this mental note at the start. After 4 hours, stop adding fresh water. We now want the level to drop and the broth to get thicker. It's now important to stir the stock often, as the lower the level gets, the easier it burns. After about 2 hours in the thickening stage, we're adding in our aromatics. We are adding in some spring onion, a whole bulb of garlic, an apple, and most importantly, a sheet of kombu. Most aromatics are up to personal taste, but the kombu is pretty important. Please let us know in the comments which other aromatics you like to add. Once these have been added, let it boil for another 2 hours. After 2 hours, strain all the liquid into a different pot, discarding all the bones and aromatics, moving the stock to a clean pot in the process. Put the clean pot with the stock back on the heat and bring it to an intense rolling boil for about 5 minutes. Use an immersion blender to blend this. This will aerate the stock and spread around all the fat and collagen evenly. This step isn't necessary, but it will ensure that your stock gets that deep white color. With one jar, we skipped this final step. Can you spot the difference? It's subtle, but it's there. Now we're freezing half of the stock and jarring the other half, like we usually do. They will stay fine in the fridge for a couple of days. If you followed all steps correctly, the next day your stock will be very thick. You should probably have a spoon ready when you want to use it. In the 20th century, wow, just a lot happened all over the world. But in Japan, a noodle seller was distracted while cooking, and this would have consequences no one could have foreseen. This discovery will be what we make in this episode of our journey from the oldest Chinese noodles to a modern bowl of ramen. The road to ramen. Today we will be making a traditional Tonkotsu ramen, which is apparently a delicious accident. As we know from our last episode, Cantonese alkali noodles made their way to Japan during the Meiji Restoration. Initially, they appeared on the menus of restaurants focusing on all types of foreign foods, in the wake of the country's reopening in the 19th century. However, these first iterations did not seem to have had a lasting impact on the cuisine. We don't even know if they resembled what we call ramen today. The roots of ramen, as we know and love today, originate from migration. When Japan had just reopened to foreigners, immigrants were only allowed to settle in specific spots near ports, most notably in Yokohama and Kobe. Most of these immigrants were Chinese, and they mainly came from Taiwan and the Pearl River Delta. The latter group brought with them the juksing noodles we made in the last episode. How did you get here? Well, anyway, although ramen did originate here, the first dedicated restaurant wasn't opened here. No, the first ramen restaurant was in Asakusa. That's not that far from where you are. He doesn't mind going to the other side of the planet, but a quick train ride is too much. What a weird man. Ah, yes. It was here, in Asakusa, that the first dedicated ramen restaurant was opened in 1909 by a customs official working in the port of Yokohama, staffed by Chinese immigrants. This one, Yoroya, is one of those first ones, and it still stands today. This wasn't the first one though. No, the first one, opened by their customs official, was Rairaiken, which sadly isn't here anymore, but they have recreated it in Yokohama's Ramen Museum. Yes, we weren't just there. I never asked you to come all the way to Japan. So here it is, Rairaiken, the first ramen restaurant. Although they didn't call it that, at this point it was still called Nanking Soba. The word ramen, the origin of which is the subject of much debate, would come about later. Yes, go on, go get some ramen. And here it is, the original shoyu ramen that started it all. But we're not going to bother making this one. No, this one is much too similar to the Cantonese noodles we made in our previous episode. It's even kneaded with a bamboo pole. Therefore, we are going to go for the most famous bowl of ramen to actually originate from Japan, Tonkotsu, which comes from Fukuoka. After World War II, a horrible rice harvest had forced a lot of Asia to switch to wheat products, and there was a veritable boom in ramen, especially here in Fukuoka. Here, people started mixing ramen, which was gaining traction in Tokyo, with Nagasaki shampon, a local pork soup. The rest is pretty much history. Although the first iterations were not the creamy, thick soup we know and love today. The original mixture was much clearer and runnier. As we've alluded to, the thick broth was an accident. We covered the story of this accident last week in our broth video, which you can find here. And therefore, these are the noodles which we will be making in our kitchen. Wow. Wait, how did you do that? Anyway, first things first, the noodles. The essence of noodle making is in the ratios. Making Japanese ramen is a science, not an art. For one portion, we are using 99 grams of flour, 1 gram of salt, 30 grams of water, and 5 grams of our lye water. This will give you a 35% hydration, which is quite dry, but is on the more hydrated side for Tonkotsu ramen. It is, however, very hard to just make one portion, so we are making a batch of 4. Mixing everything will create loose dough crumbs. The hard bit is sticking these together. Today this is mostly done by machines, but we will be doing this with elbow grease. You're done once all the dough sticks together. No need to make it nice and smooth, because nature is going to do this work for us. Just let the dough rest for 2 to 3 hours. All you need to do is make sure there's some external pressure on the ball and no moisture is lost. You can do this with cling film or a tight cloth. After the dough has rested, proceed to cut it into 4 pieces of roughly 130 grams each. Shape these into ice hockey pucks and then put them through your pasta roller. The first couple of times the dough will completely disintegrate. Don't worry, that's normal. Just stick it back together like this and feed it through again. Once it stays in one piece, start laminating it on the widest setting. This means folding it double and feeding it through again. Do this 10 times. Then start reducing the machine to the desired width. For tonkotsu, we recommend going quite thin. Go under 2 mm if you can. Once you have a nice thin sheet, dust it with a bit of corn flour or potato starch, run it through the cutter attachment and make them into bird's nests. You can keep these in the fridge for about a week. And we recommend you make them at least a day in advance, as a day of rest makes them, in our experience, snappier. Now that our noodles are ready, we can get started with the fun bit, the char siu. In the previous episode, we made Chinese char siu. And it won't surprise you that char siu is the Japanified version of this. Where char siu is traditionally made in a charcoal grill, it appears that Chinese immigrants forgot to pack their grills when they came to Japan. So instead of a grill, char siu uses a traditional Japanese method, which is actually much easier to do at home. But first we need to prepare our meat. Unlike char siu is usually made with pork belly, of which we're going to remove the skin. Once the skin is removed, we're going to truss it. You can also just cut it up into slices, but the rolled version is more iconic. Tie up the belly like this. If you are having trouble with the technique, we'll leave some links to good guides below. There are ample different methods to make this, some including many blanching steps, which we are not going to do. We are starting by giving our meat a good sear in a bit of oil, so it gets a bit of char. Now set this aside while we prepare our marinade. For a 500 gram joint like this, we are going to need a base of 200 milliliters of soy sauce, 100 milliliters of mirin, 50 milliliters of cooking sake, the same amount of Shaoxing wine, 100 grams of sugar, and 300 milliliters of water. Put this in a pot and bring it up to a gentle heat until all the sugar has dissolved. Now pop in your roll and leave it there to gently simmer. To prevent the liquid evaporating, we're going to use an old Japanese technique, otoshibuta or drop lid. If you don't have one of these, you can easily make one out of tin foil. Turn over the meat every 20 minutes or so for the next 2 hours. When the meat is ready, take it out of the pot. Put it in a bag with some of its liquid and fridge it. Trust us, like the noodles, it's better the next day. Don't discard the liquid. We still need that. Boil some eggs for 7 minutes, then shock them in ice water. Peel them and place them in yet another bag. This one's reusable though. Cover them with the braising liquid remaining in the pot. Pop this bag in the fridge alongside the meat. This is how you make those dark ramen eggs. In Japan, ramen is fast food, so it's not cheating to make things the day in advance. Plenty of ramen shops work this way. Still hard work though. The next day we can finally turn our kitchen into our own private ramen bar. But first we need to do some more preparations. We're going to start with preparing our toppings. We're cutting some toasted nori, Naruto fish cake, prepping some corn, cutting woody mushroom and spring onion, getting out our ramen egg, and of course, slicing our chasu. These should all be ready, so once the noodles are in the bowl, they can be added quickly. We don't want our noodles to get soggy. The second part of preparations is our tare. This is in essence the seasoning of our broth, and one of the main differences between Cantonese jukseng noodles and Japanese ramen. There are no rules with regards to the tare. It is where ramen chefs express their creativity. Some shops have a tare of over 100 ingredients, others simply add some salt and oil. All of this is very much down to personal taste. We like this recipe: some ground sesame seeds, a bit of sesame oil, a dash of soy sauce, some salt and pepper, a spoonful of oyster sauce, and finally we are grating in a clove of garlic. Give all of this a good stir and the tare is ready. Let us know your favorite tare in the comments below. With our mise en place ready, we now need to warm up our stock. Like we did throughout this entire series, we made this stock in a separate video, which you can watch here. If you followed the steps in that video, you should either have bags of frozen broth or jars in the fridge. Whatever you ended up doing, if you did it the right way, they will be solid by now. Once in the pot, bring it to a light simmer. Don't let it get to a rolling boil, as we don't want this to reduce any further. While the broth is warming up, you can also bring a pot of water to the boil. With the broth and noodle water getting up to temperature, we can really start picturing our own little ramen shop. Use this time to practice your most enthusiastic irashaimase. When it's time to eat, take your serving bowl, spoon in some tare, and ladle over some stock so the bowl is just over half full. As soon as you've done this, lower some noodles into the boiling water. You can do this with tongs, but we recommend getting one of these mini strainers. They're cheap and worth it. Your noodles will be ready in under a minute, and you need to keep moving them while they boil so they don't clump. After 40 or so seconds, take out your noodles and shake out the excess water. Gently drop the ramen into the soup. Be careful, it's easy to cause a bit of a messy splash here. Once they're in, lift them up and fold them nicely so they look a bit tidy. Then quickly add your toppings. This needs to go quick because we don't want our ramen to go soggy. And there we have our finished bowl of authentic Tonkotsu ramen. As our human enjoys his bowl of traditional Tonkotsu ramen, we look back on the road we took here. From the first millet noodles from 4,000 years ago. Wait, what are you doing here? Oh, I see. And we can make that? Well, dear viewer, it looks like there will be another episode. Shouldn't you go do dishes? Today we made very traditional ramen, but in our next bonus episode, we will be making ramen that's all the rage in Tokyo right now. Tori Paitan. Hi and welcome into Burner. We came all the way from the first Chinese noodle from 2000 BC via the stalls of Kaifeng and the ports of Hong Kong to the bone broth of Hakata. Today we, for real this time, conclude the road to ramen. Our final installment will be this Tori Paitan, which we can only describe as the essence of chicken. There is no storied history to this dish, so we have time to make the entire dish in this episode, although we will be referring to our previous videos for some techniques. We're opting for Tori Paitan as the ramen signifying the present day because when the human was in Japan, he noticed Tori Paitan was all the rage in the trendier parts of Ikebukuro. Yes, the choice of recipe for this episode was based entirely on our anecdotal evidence. There might not be a lot of history to these, but there is some historic symbolism here. The first instant ramen was chicken ramen. Many believe that its accessible flavor was a major factor in ramen's growth to popularity. And it might be why we call ramen, well, ramen. Now, what we are about to say is entirely our theory. Pure speculation. A bric-a-brac from things we scrape together. Remember how we said in a previous episode that there's a bit of debate over the exact origin of the word ramen? There are loads of theories out there. Most say, and we agree, that it is likely a Japanification of the word ramyeon. But we made both of these and they are not that similar. Ramen aren't even pulled. And that's the whole point of ramyeon. Well, the early ramen eaters would agree, as they were originally called Nanking or Nanjing soba. The soba being the traditional Japanese noodle from Nanjing. However, this is a misnomer, as Nanjing is in northern China, whereas the origin of ramen lies in the south. Then the name Shina soba became popular. This literally means the soba from China. This name sounds fine, but is actually somewhat contentious. The normal word for China in Japanese is chukoku, which means middle land. This is also the name China gives itself. For Japan to refer to China by its Western name, Shina, sounds innocuous, but it was a clear rejection of the centuries-old China-centric naming convention. Therefore, its use is often linked with Japan's imperial period. After World War II, this name fell out of use and made way for Chuka soba, a less contentious name based off Chugoku, the traditional name for China. So you might now see how none of these names even remotely sound like ramen. And nobody really knows how ramen beat out the other ones. What we do know is that from World War II, ramen stalls were banned due to wheat rationing, so serving them would be illegal, and stalls would be supplied by the Yakuza. It's pretty common for illegally traded goods to get many different names, we think. And we do emphasize think, as that's when the word ramen, as in the Japanification of ramyeon, started getting used more and more. Saying ramen instead of Shina soba would essentially be saying, got any of those Chinese noodles? Wink wink, nudge nudge, know what I mean? After the war, Japan suffered a rice shortage. So the United States, keen to prevent the country collapsing and falling to communism, started providing flour, which led to the bans being relaxed and then fully abolished. By the late 1940s, references to ramen started appearing in radio shows. And in the 50s, they started popping up in films, usually referred to as the food for students and those down on their luck. Although in that same era, there was still ample other pieces of media calling it chuka soba. And some hardliners were even still calling it Shina soba. So what helped ramen win the day? Enter Momofuku Ando. Like ramen itself, the inventor of instant ramen and founder of Nissin was also not originally Japanese. He was born Go-Pe-Hok in Taiwan and only became the Japanese citizen Momofuku Ando as an adult. He developed instant ramen and named it chicken ramen. This product was clearly aimed at the wider world. The original pack contained Romaji lettering, despite it initially not being meant for export. It even used the word chicken instead of the Japanese tori. Momofuku Ando chose chicken because, unlike pork or beef, there were no large parts of the world where consumption of chicken was frowned upon. It appears his choices were based on commercial viability, and that's why we think he chose the word ramen instead of chuka soba. It simply made more commercial sense. In addition to that, ramen is very easy to type in Roman letters and hardly leads to any confusion. Except in the Dutch-speaking world, where ramen means windows, which means looking for lunch there is very confusing. We ended up doing a history skit anyway. So now that we've explained why we're making essence of chicken ramen, let's actually make it. As this is a chicken stock, we're starting with a 1.5 kilogram chicken, which we're going to reduce to a carcass by cutting off the thighs and breasts. These will later become our meat toppings. To compensate for this loss of meat, we're going to need a bit of extra chickeniness. We're doing this by adding 1 kilo of chicken wings. Is that enough chicken? No, it isn't. We're also going to add 1 kilogram of chicken feet. If you can't get feet, just use extra wings. The pot now contains a total of 3 kilograms of chicken bits. Flood it with water and then boil in the exact same way we did with the tonkotsu stock in this video. That means bring it to a boil for 1 minute, refresh the water and clean the pot, and then bring it back to a boil. Like with our tonkotsu, we're first doing a replenishing phase where we keep our stock topped up with boiling water. After 4 hours, we enter the thickening stage, which will also take up 4 hours. Here we stop adding fresh water and let it reduce. And then, for the final 2 hours, add some spring onion, garlic, ginger and kombu as aromatics. After 2 hours with aromatics in the pot, strain the stock. Then bring the stock to a rolling boil. and blend it with an immersion blender. Freeze or cool, and if you did it all correctly, you will end up with a really creamy chicken broth. And it needs to be, because that's what tori paitan means, white chicken soup. Next up, our meat topping. You can just use pork char siu for this, but we're going to up the chickeniness even more. First, marinate the thighs and breast pieces we cut off the carcass. Our marinade is made of soy sauce, mirin, cooking sake, shaoxing wine, and sugar. Warm this up so the sugar dissolves. We can prepare this in a pot with a drop lid, or even a pressure cooker. But we are going to go even more modern. We're going to sous vide. Put the chicken in a bag with the marinade and a small piece of kombu. Seal and place this in the water for at least an hour at 66 degrees Celsius. Once it's done, get it out of the bag, pat it dry and save the marinade. Now we need to add some char. Oh dear, we here removed the skin, but you can leave that on. We just thought it was a bit too greasy. Now that it's a bit charred, you can eat it straight away, but we're going to put it in the fridge for a night, because in chicken ramen we need a ramen egg. So take the marinade from the sous vide bag and use them for medium boiled eggs. Pop these in the fridge along with the meat. The next day it's time for super chicken ramen. Like last time, we're going to prep our toppings first. We're going with some nori, spring onion, our eggs, some naruto, and of course our chicken. But as per usual, this is up to you. We are keeping our tare really simple, since we don't want to overpower the flavor of the chicken. So take a base of sesame oil, season this with salt, white pepper, and MSG. For bringing it all together, we're using the same setup as we did in the previous video. Jiggly stock on one side and a big pot of boiling water on the other. As this is all coming up to temperature, we're going to get our noodles ready. If you want to make your own noodles, go see how we did that in the previous episode. And with everything good to go, let's make us a bowl of ramen. Spoon some tare in a bowl and ladle over some stock. Then get some noodles boiling. Keep them moving as they are boiling. Noodles in the bowl, top up with some extra stock if needed. Add the toppings and done. And there it is, ramen, all caught up to the modern day. So of course we need to take a picture. We can now dig into what is essentially a bowl of collagen with some dough strands. And it is glorious collagen. Trust us, your lips will be sticky but very healthy. As soon as we reach the last sip of this soup, we have also reached the end of our road to ramen. And it was a long and winding road, but one submersed in milky soup mixture. And we would like some more. Where was I going with this? Oh yes, the road that led us here from the Song dynasty to the Qing, from Guangzhou to Asakusa, and then to the whole world. The story of ramen is an interesting one, a fun one, a taxing one, but above all, a tasty one. And we hope you enjoyed the journey as much as we did. Please leave a like if you did, and subscribe if you haven't already. If you really want to be our hero, go ahead and leave a comment. It really means the world to us. We're going to go away again for a bit, but not for too long this time, as we're moving on from the series concept. We might do a series in the future, but as it stands we are looking at doing one-off episodes to minimize the long gaps like we had last time. We hope to see you again for these very soon. Thank you very much for watching.